Hi, my name is Skipper Chung Warson, and I'm a design director in San Francisco. And welcome to How This Works. This is a show where I invite people on to talk about a topic that they know incredibly well. And today, I have Carl Welty with me. He's going to talk to us about being an architect and his work in sustainable design. Thanks for taking time to be here, Carl.
You're very welcome, and thank you for inviting me to this wonderful conversation.
So, Carl, tell us some things about you. Who are you?
Well, it's pretty clear that I think that we are obligated to leave the world better than what it was when we found it.
Okay.
And we are now at a crossroads in human history that's an enormous challenge, and we have much work to do on that. A few other things is I like when asked that question, it's fun to tell people I was born in Roswell, New Mexico. And in a further conversation about my way I approach architecture, some people think that the fact I was born in Roswell, New Mexico has an influence on how I think about architecture.
And specifically, if people don't know much about Roswell, one of the things that it's really well known for is this notion of aliens and isn't Area 52? Is that what it is? Area 52?
Area 51.
51.
I know this because I was an Air Force brat, which is why I was born in Roswell, New Mexico.
Ah.
But Area 51 is in Nevada.
Okay.
Roswell is famous because of in 1949, there's a supposed crash of an alien ship.
Oh.
And the Air Force did an autopsy on an alien.
Okay.
So that's quite different than Area 51.
Okay, I see. Shows how much I know about Roswell, New Mexico. So that was in 1949 is when it allegedly happened?
Yes.
Okay. Born in Roswell, you were an Air Force brat. Where else in the world did you end up?
I wasn't so traumatized by moving too many times because I was the youngest in my family.
Okay.
But so Roswell lived in Turkey, and this is in the late 60s, which is a great experience, and then California. But Turkey, climbing around old castles and seeing old ruins, has shaped the way I think about architecture and sustainability. Particularly this lesson of civilizations and cities come and go. And this is always in the back of my mind with the question of preparing for climate change, or how we, building cities that are more resilient and more efficient.
Okay.
So the history of past cultures looms large in my thinking and how I approach design. I
see. So, Carl, what's something about you that people may not guess? Something you feel comfortable sharing?
Oh, I thought being born in Roswell was.
That's definitely an interesting fact for sure.
Here's the first thing that comes to mind, which is something that, again, an emotional thing that I deal with in that I'm a sensitive or thoughtful artist because I'm kind of a big guy.
Okay.
I sometimes I say that people think of me as a contractor and not a designer, not an architect, because I look more like a contractor than an architect. Okay.
Well, and I also think there's an important lesson in that we're not always who we might present as. So I appreciate that.
Thanks.
So, Carl, what are we talking about today? I mean, I gave some of it away in our introduction, but I'd love to hear you say it. What are the things that we're going to talk about that you know a lot about?
We're going to talk about sustainable design, which is in the minds of many people. And, sustainable there's a term that I prefer, regenerative design. And we can say more about that. But how do we build affordable, energy efficient, resilient homes and communities? So we're going to talk about that. And also nearer to my heart and soul is the art, and not art as artifacts or design, but I believe art when it operates at the highest level says something about how we have in the past see the world.
Okay.
But I think also I would like to talk about how art has shaped how we understand or see nature, or see the world outside of us.
Sure.
Specifically, I would talk about my take on Renaissance art and what we call modern art or European 20th century art, Cubism and Picasso and modern art.
Awesome. All of that they're very meaty subjects. So I say
Yes.
we jump right in.
Okay.
So what in your mind is sustainable design? Like how would you define it? And then you also mentioned another term, this idea of regenerative design. How is for you the idea of regenerative design a more appropriate term for how you think about this topic?
So regenerative design, it can feel like a new buzzword.
Okay.
But I think in the history of sustainable thinking in the last 30 or 40 years, it really predates sustainable design.
Okay.
And regenerative design is building community, building buildings, a home in a way that works more like nature or generates energy. A great example that people like to use is like a tree, for example. A tree creates 200 times more energy than it requires.
Oh, wow.
So the leaves that that grows, that helps absorbs the energy.
Sure.
As they fall off, or as they fall off in that sort of cycle, those leaves become compost or energy that goes back into the earth.
Okay.
And other systems, other plants and animals who use that energy. Another I think important distinction is sustainable design is using less.
Okay.
So it's conserve, but regenerative is about creating systems that create more, like the tree. And so in closing, I'd say that we're past the point where using less isn't enough.
I see.
That we have to build communities that create energy or create resources like all other species or other systems.
Okay.
So the regenerative, I think, is a better goal.
I think that those are really important distinctions between sustainable design and regenerative design. And that idea that a tree creates 200 times more energy than it needs, I don't know that I ever thought about it that way. That's a fascinating way to position that. So what are things that, and like you pointed out, the notion of being sustainable is about conserving and using less and being more responsible with existing resources. What do we need to be thinking about for the future? Like, what are some of the issues that you see at hand?
Well, since I'm an architect, we'll talk about the future of building buildings and building communities.
Sure.
And starting from this inspiration of creating buildings, communities that are operating in a way that's generating energy and not just consuming energy.
Okay.
We're starting to make buildings with solar panels, which is an example of generating energy on site or through the building.
Okay.
You're generating energy in clearly a more efficient way than burning fossil fuels and carbon-based energy systems.
Sure.
We can all agree that solar panels is more sustainable than burning fossil fuels.
Sure.
It's certainly less impact on global climate in the increasing the carbon dioxide in our environment.
Yeah.
A better course for regenerative design or building buildings and communities is working with nature more holistically.
Okay.
It's shockingly, I think, simpler in how we do that. The quickest way to explain that, or the science of that, was well established and researched in the 70s.
Okay.
And so what we call passive solar design.
Okay.
And that's sort of the first thing to go to. Simply put, I mean, at the first level, passive solar design is about orienting buildings to the south.
Okay.
And when you do that, then you start absorbing energy directly from the sun. I think a simpler, more cost-effective way of heating and cooling our buildings,
okay,
and lighting our buildings than using solar panels or other machines.
Okay.
we'll talk more about that. But I think that my approach to sustainable or regenerative design, the using nature or passive solar, it stands in contrast, or it's a little outside of the way the typical approach to energy efficiency is thought of.
Yeah.
At the core of it is working with nature, again, more organically and more a homegrown sort of way. Yeah. And it really literally is building buildings that heat and cool themselves using the parts of a building that we would include anyways.
Sure. So if this notion of passive solar design has been around since the 70s, I would imagine that architects and home builders and people who do commercial construction, they've all been doing it, taking advantage of these things to build houses and office buildings and other kinds of spaces, right?
You would think that, but they haven't.
Oh, that's disappointing.
So I'm old enough to have gone to school in the 70s and early 80s.
Okay.
And
did you go to school to study architecture?
I did.
Okay.
I went to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo.
Okay.
A lovely place to go to college.
Yes.
And, this is, the late 70s was really the peak of thinking of this.
Okay.
And I had a class called Passive Solar Design in 1979.
Okay. Taught
by a gentleman who's still alive, who's a real national leader in passive solar design.
And what is his name?
His name is Ken Haggard.
Okay.
Haggard. Great. And for another project that we're working on, I've had the opportunity to reach out to him, and because I thought he has so much to learn, to teach us still, and he does.
Yeah, that's great.
So that history of passive solar in the 70s, it was inspired or necessitated by the oil embargo from the 73 and 79. And at the time, we started to think that we would reach peak oil sometime in the early 21st century.
Okay.
And much like today, where the state of California encourages us to be innovative with solar panels and other energy systems, the state of California was paying people like Ken Haggard to write books and do research on building homes and structures that were more energy efficient.
Okay.
So it's a really great history that perhaps could be its own show. But Ken Haggard built a home in 1972 that was heated and cooled 100% by natural systems.
Oh, wow.
And the cost of, in general, about passive solar are these systems, they really don't add construction costs to the buildings.
Okay.
And they remain, they're more efficient than kind of the best approach, most expensive approach we have today. I like to kind of summarize in this way that a well-designed passive solar building doesn't add cost to the construction. And you can approach 50% more efficient than a normal building. You can increase the construction cost a little bit, and get that up to beyond 50%, generally speaking. Yeah. But it's the typical green building that we think about today. We sort of peak out about 30% better than normal.
Oh, really?
And can increase the construction cost 50% or more.
Okay.
To me, it's an extraordinary opportunity to become more aware of how we can make buildings 2 and 3 times more efficient than what we think of as the best buildings. Yeah. But without increasing construction cost.
Sure.
And it's not pursued very much.
Okay. Well, in a previous conversation, Carl, you and I talked about how, and you shared this fact with me, so I'm just repeating back something that you had talked about. But by last year, by 2020, the state of California was requiring that all new construction of homes needed to be net zero energy. And one of the things you pointed out to me is that homes consume about 1/3 of the energy used in the state. So it seems like there's a really strong incentive to do things like passive solar design, and especially if it doesn't add much more in terms of construction costs. Why aren't builders or architects or other folks in the construction industry, why aren't they taking advantage of these things?
Let me go back to the history of passive solar. Okay. So as I said, the peak of this, the research or the interest in this was the 70s and early 80s.
Okay.
And to your question of why aren't we doing that more?
Okay.
I believe we lost interest in that. The development industry or the design industry lost interest in this because Ronald Reagan in the early 80s and oil became very cheap in the 80s. And so there wasn't the incentive as in the 70s, from the threat of oil embargoes and loss of energy.
Sure. And
so cheap oil from the 80s and 90s, we lost focus on this other way of building.
Okay.
But another part of it is culturally, when the architects and just as our culture, that we look to machines to solve our problems. And I think that through passive solar or these other natural systems, it's a different way of thinking. We have to sort of stop and pause and ask the question: can we do better? Kind of looking at nature and seeing how nature works and being inspired by that.
Yeah. What are some of the strategies that you would point out, things that builders, architects, homeowners can do to take advantage of something like that?
Great question. I've come to this thinking that, when I talk about working with nature, there's, I think if there's 4 things in nature that we have to be aware of. And it's all very simple and very obvious. But the first one is the sun is higher in the summer than it is in the winter. Okay. And I think we're kind of aware of that, but not really. That can be part of, be more forward in our minds. Sure. Number 2 is the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Yeah. And that the sun is in each day, the highest point of the day, the sun is more or less due south. Okay. And the third sort of aspect of nature, and this is particularly true in California or other dry desert climates or climate zones that are not hot and humid, the nighttime temperature is always 25 to 30 degrees cooler than in the daytime. I see. And we can use that to help cool our buildings. So this passive solar or natural systems, it's not just about heating, but it's also about cooling the buildings naturally. Okay. And the fourth part is that we can, on any location, you can rely on a prevailing winds or breezes that are pretty consistent. Yeah. So the first step in passive solar is just sort of saying this is what nature provides us. Yeah. And if you work within these rules or what nature provides us, you can do extraordinary things. You make buildings and communities affordable and much more efficient and more resilient. Okay. And I think we also talked a bit, maybe getting ahead of ourselves, but the next, how we use those facts of nature is to think about the building not as this box that has energy flowing into it from the energy grid, or a building that's just a box that has machines on the top, solar panels, or machines inside to provide thermal comfort or energy. So I start to think about have this question of, can we think about the building envelope as an energy system? I see. And I think that's a good way to think about it. And what I mean is the parts of the buildings. So to me, this is the flip side of these facts of how nature works. Okay. But the parts of the building that we have to think, we can think about as systems, energy systems, are the things that are in buildings: windows, roof overhangs, walls, well-insulated walls, and the concrete. Usually, typically a concrete slab or something within the building that acts as a energy storage system. Okay. And that's what we call thermal mass. It's the easiest things to think about are concrete or water, or something that will absorb heat. So in the wintertime, you want the sun to come into the window and heat that thermal mass up. And then at night, when it's cool, it's cooler, that heat radiates out to heat the space. Yeah. And the flip side of that, in the summer, you use the roof overhangs to keep the sun out to start with, so the building doesn't get as hot. And that thermal mass that energy storage system is cooled by the cool night air, by ventilation.
I see.
So during the day, that chilled thermal mass absorbs the heat that comes into the building, keeping the building cooler.
Yeah.
So maybe that's something people know about. Maybe is old adobe structures work that way.
Okay.
Except that they don't have insulation. So you also need you want the building shell to be insulated as well.
Yeah.
So to me, this idea of a building as an energy system and a storage system, and why it's so cost effective, is it's just using the stuff that buildings are composed of, windows and roof overhangs.
Yeah.
And it's just about locating them differently, thinking about them differently. And when that's done, then you get a building that's 50% or more efficient than a normal building without increasing the construction costs. You're just using the things you're already there.
Yeah. I think those things are important to consider as you're making a house, right? But what about some place that you already live? Maybe, let's say you're renting or you've moved into an existing house. How are ways that you can take advantage of that passive solar effect to a better purpose?
Another great question. When I talk about these questions, which I do a lot, people often say, well, what about existing buildings?
Sure.
And the first is there's always something that can be done. And of course, easier to do in a building that you own and not renting.
Sure.
But for me, the first example is because also, existing buildings don't typically have the correct orientation. In many buildings, we know many existing buildings don't have that optimal orientation. But what can be done easily is the ventilation, using nighttime ventilation for cooling a building.
Yeah.
And this is why it's important to think about passive solar is not just about the sun and heating, but also cooling.
I see.
And in much of California, the energy required to keep the building cool is more or is the same as keeping it warm, or sometimes requires more energy. And as with climate change and global warming, cooling will become more and more important.
Yeah.
And so an existing home or building with some, I think, pretty simple retrofitting, you can start ventilating. Designing the building to be vented at night to take that cooler night air to cool off thermal mass.
Yeah.
So things can be done.
Okay. I like the previous example that you gave of an Adobe structure and how there were certain advantages, but one of the disadvantages of Adobe is that it's not well insulated. And I think that's something that if you are in a home environment where you can't make many changes, maybe that's something that you could do is put up curtains or blinds as a way of insulating against the sun. And then those are things that you can open up at night to facilitate that ventilation.
Yeah, that's really it. And I would also add that insulating is kind of what we think of as the first step to making older homes more efficient. If an existing home or structure has, too much sun coming in from the west, which is pretty common, and another simple natural system is planting trees for shading. Okay. And you plant deciduous trees that will let the sun in the winter because they lose their leaves and shade the structure from the summer sun. Okay. To me, that's also another, I think, beautiful example of what nature provides us. Yeah. Maybe I should also just add this, in addition to the building as an energy system, but think about the landscape as part of the building energy system, which I think is another kind of leap or thing to think about. So it's not just we have a building and then the landscape is this thing you do on the outside that's just for decoration. I see. You've mentioned a couple times in our conversation the idea of climate change and how our natural world is changing from what it was a few decades ago. And I know my wife and I just moved from New York City. And one of the things that we've encountered, and we live in the Bay Area, is this notion of having a fire season. And not only the dangers of, because it's so dry, fires breaking out, either that are caused naturally. There were some fires here that happened last summer that were as a result of lightning strikes, or deliberately. And so
One of the things that you and I talked about in a previous conversation is this idea of how we think about our homes can also influence those things, this threat of fire existing in the world. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, this is a really important part of building sustainable or resilient communities. In California or much of the West is this threat of wildfires. It's California, the West has always been, fires have always been a problem.
Yeah.
Even long before white man came.
Yeah.
But with climate change, the season of wildfires is now almost the entire year.
Right.
We all know that this is such an increased risk of fire.
Yeah.
For me, the building more fire resistant homes is super critical, because there's thousands and thousands of people who want to rebuild. Yeah. And would like to rebuild in areas that will continue to be a fire risk. This is the second part of the second half of my thinking about sustainable design, which the construction, and so and this is under the category of resilient.
Okay,
building a resilient or more durable, and so the two halves are, for me, is energy, the energy component, and we talked about using nature to solve that problem. So the other half is resilient.
Okay.
So resilient is resilient, durable. So for me, I think, again, affordable solution for more fire resistant, more resilient homes and communities is not building with wood.
Okay.
At the first level is because wood is combustible.
Right.
And there's ways we build, and there's codes that require us to build homes that are more fire resistant.
Okay.
But in the end, it's more combustible. To other materials.
Didn't we learn this lesson in the Three Little Pigs with the second little pig?
Yes. So for me, I think my first choice solution for homes is building with light gauge steel.
Okay.
For me, the questioning of not building with wood started 20 years ago.
Okay.
With working on two home projects. One is I wanted to have a post exposed to be stained and to express the beauty of wood.
Okay.
And I specified what with the highest quality of wood one can get.
Sure.
And so this post, the 4x4 post, was delivered to the site, and it looked really great. But within a week or so, on the site, and contractors, they bring lumber and flooring and these
all the materials.
Products.
Sure.
They bring them to the site, and they to acclimate to the moisture, to the site.
Sure.
And so within a week, that beautiful post twisted and split.
Oh, wow.
It was not going to work the way I wanted it to work.
I see.
The other lesson at the same time was a client had just finished a large 2-story addition to their house, and their exterminator advised them to tent the house immediately after finishing.
What is the tint?
Tenting to exterminate.
I see.
To kill termites.
I see.
And I was surprised by that, because when they told me that, I said, "Well, but it's all new lumber."
Right.
And their exterminator told them that the new lumber is bringing termites into the house.
Oh, wow.
And since learning that in subsequent research, and it's a whole other universe.
Sure.
Is that the termites it's a big issue, and it's another issue that's going to become a larger issue because of climate change, and there's new species of more aggressive termites, and that's a whole other story. But we all know that termites are a problem.
Okay.
But backing up a bit with this issue of wood, in addition to trying to find an alternative that's not as combustible. Okay. What I've learned is the wood we have today is not like the wood we had 100 years ago. Particularly, California, we all know beautiful old craftsman homes that are beautiful and they look great like they did 100 years ago. Yeah. But all that lumber was old growth lumber. I see. So it's, very old trees that we don't have anymore. Yeah. And even if we could log it, we shouldn't. Yeah. For all the reasons we understand. Right. And so most of the framing and construction up through the 70s was old growth lumber.
Okay.
And so in the 80s, that lumber was no longer available. The quality of lumber has continued to degrade since then.
I see.
And so now we have lumber that's it's grown very fast.
Okay.
For economic reasons, and that's because the lumber has grown fast, cut down earlier, younger. It's not as stable.
I see. So
in addition to being more flammable, it's just not as stable as the lumber from long ago.
Yeah.
So looking for affordable systems, alternative systems like cold form steel or light gauge steel.
Yeah.
For me, it has to be affordable. So it's not. We need systems that people can afford.
Yeah. I mean, that doesn't feel like a very winning proposition to have lumber that is more flammable, less stable, and as termite species are changing, tends to attract more termites as well. That sounds like a bad proposition.
I believe so. The termite species that we're most concerned about is called Formosan termites, and they're
Formosan,
more.
Okay.
The center of these termites in America is Florida and New Orleans.
Okay.
They swarm in larger colonies.
Okay.
Like really big colonies. And as I said, they're more aggressive. And, there's stories that one can find from in New Orleans where, a 2-story wood wall is completely demolished within a couple of years.
Wow.
So it's really different.
Yeah.
As animal species they migrate, and as this climate gets warmer and warmer up to the north and to the west, they continue to migrate, and so there are colonies in California. So anyway, that's to me is an issue that's looming out there. Yeah, we need to think about. Yeah. So that's just recapping this idea of the energy issue, and then also resiliency are durable. So this building with steel is a way to build non-combustible and increased fire resistance, but it's also it's a structural system that's good for hundreds of years. Yeah, and even without termites or fire, I think a wood home built from the lumber that's available today, it's certainly not going to last 100 years, even if it's covered up in stucco walls. Sure. So building with cold form steel and other systems, we can dependably build something that will last hundreds of years. I see. Without requiring chemicals for killing termites and more fire resistant, no mold. So sure. Anyway, that's these kind of two parts of sustainable design: resilient and energy efficient. Okay. Well, I love that you brought up this notion of a building that lasts for hundreds of years. So I want to get into one of the other topics that you had previewed, which is around, you have an interest in art, and that has influenced the way that you think about this notion of sustainable design or regenerative design. Can you talk a little bit about where that started for you? How did that begin? Kind of sheepishly, or almost because of my background or my technical training, I always have felt embarrassed about these very esoteric ideas. But in some ways, this questioning of interest in history comes from, again, living in Turkey and having the experience of history being real. You climb on old castles or ruined cities. And so the result, when in college, I stumbled upon a history class that at schools like at Cal Poly, where it's a very technically oriented education. Okay. Stumbling into a class on medieval history was outside the norm, was unusual. But as a young architecture student, and I think of it as the lesson I learned in this class from a teacher who was very inspiring was, if I were to read more, I would learn more. Sure. And coming from a kid from a family that education wasn't such a high priority, that was a lesson that I had to learn. I see. And anyway, so from that class, I just started to read more from the library, that beyond what we were required in our architectural history classes. Okay. And it is also one of the prefaces. In architecture school, we were taught, and we are still taught, that drawing perspective, it's real.
Yeah.
Like, that's how we see the world.
Yeah.
And when I say perspective, it's specifically linear perspective, or this perspective that's highlighted in high Renaissance art.
Okay.
So starting from this idea that we're taught to believe that drawing perspective is real, it's accurate, it's a true representation of the nature.
Okay.
Also to say that in architecture school, as architects, we're taught to believe that. We're taught how to draw those. But it's a cultural norm as well. So even outside of architects or people who are taught to draw that way, our culture reminds us that perspective is real, or photographs, or cameras work that way, or cameras prove, every time we take a picture, they prove that, oh yes, that those rules work.
Okay.
That's how we see nature.
Yeah.
Some reading I was doing outside of my history classes, I learned that perspective was invented in 1413.
Oh, wow.
Which is, some people say that because very important architect Brunelleschi, who's most known for building the dome in Florence. But in 1413, he made a painting of the baptistry in Florence.
Okay.
And he codified the rules that we use for making precise perspective drawings.
Okay.
And so that was in 1413, and it immediately galvanized artists started to see that was the right way to do it.
Okay.
And it really ushered in the High Renaissance. And so quickly it started influencing how artists were making paintings, how architects were making cities or buildings, and it impacted urban design. And subsequently, it influenced Western science. I mean, there's lots of really wonderful books that I stumbled upon when I was on this quest as I finished college. And it is sort of the leap into Western science, I think, particularly came from artists started to develop these things, what they called perspective machines.
Okay.
First one that we kind of know about, most famous, was by Dürer, the Dutch painter.
Okay.
And I think if anybody's had an art history class, you've seen these images of, particularly, there's some really famous etchings of Dürer, the artist looking through a picture frame with a grid and looking out to nature or looking to a subject, and they transfer that subject or view of nature onto a piece of paper with the same grid.
Oh, interesting.
And so these perspective machines were not just used by artists, but they were used by the hobbyist scientists from the 1500s into the 1700s. The aristocrat artists and scientists would have these machines were part of, like having a microscope. They would have a perspective machine. I think within the history of the perspective machines is how started us to think about that we can represent nature and know nature with 100% certainty, with objectivity.
Yeah.
And some hobbyist historian, I like to say that moment of that 1413 was this moment of separation in Western culture from nature. And so this is the flip side of this, which in Western culture is Cubism, and it really started with the Impressionists. One of the things they were trying to do is find a way to represent nature that was not so predetermined as perspective. Okay. And so, like Monet's painting of the sun changing on the haystacks, and
sure.
And then they evolved into Picasso and Cubism, and where they really started to deconstruct or change the structure, pictorial structures. You have multi-view and different moments of time.
Sure.
Completely influenced by Chinese landscape painting. And so this thinking about art from other cultures, I like this idea that except for the success of Western imperialism or Western colonialism, European colonialism, that all other cultures represented nature in a way that was more like Cubism, more like Chinese landscape painting. Okay. For me, Chinese landscape painting offers an insight on how to think about representing nature in a way that's more organic. Okay. And that mode of thinking has influenced how I think about architecture in some ways. A specific building, it kind of shaped how I designed a particular building that engages the local landscape in geography I think, more naturally.
Yeah. Speaking of landscape and geography, you have a project that you're currently working on in Orange County that speaks directly to this idea of sustainable design or regenerative design, and how we can do better. Would you talk a little bit about that project?
Yes. I feel like enormously privileged to be part of the project. The project is specifically, it's a Banning Ranch site.
Okay.
And our clients is a local nonprofit that spent 20 years stopping private development on the largest privately owned undeveloped site on the coast of Orange County.
Oh, okay.
The efforts to stop the development culminated in 2017 with a California State Supreme Court ruling that really upheld the California Coastal Act and other laws in California that are in place to protect the environment.
Okay.
The effort to stop the private development of private homes, 1,500 homes, a large hotel, kind of the stuff that we know all too well. They were able to stop it not just because it was the right thing to do, but because the State Coastal Act was there. It establishes rules on how you develop protected or sensitive habitat.
Okay.
So the site is a 400-acre site. Again, it's on the coast, and it's been an oil field since 1943.
Oh, wow.
Kind of ironically, because it's been an oil field since 1943 and fenced off with very little human contact, native California coastal grass and other coastal sage scrub, the natural habitat, has been saved.
Oh, wow. What was it before it was an oil field?
Before it was an oil field, it was a cattle ranch.
Okay.
The project is exciting. In addition to that, it's a very large site, and there's an ambitious goal to restore it to pre-development standards. And the part that's really exciting for me is building a education and research campus with multiple buildings.
Okay.
But the site is an important part of this project is to tell the history of the site. And the history of the site is the history of Native Americans.
Oh, okay.
And
so even before it was a cattle ranch?
Before it was a cattle ranch.
I see.
So the goal or what the project should be about, I think, is embodied in these principles about working with nature. And even before this project, I thought that, like I said, other cultures, particularly Native American cultures, that we think we all can agree upon or all accept, that they knew how to work with nature and live with nature so much more in a healthy, non-destructive way than what we Europeans have done.
Yeah.
So at the first look at the project, there's two parts of it: is restoring the natural habitat. And it's not just the plants, but it's also the animals and endangered animals that use that natural habitat to live.
Yeah.
Burrowing owl, and and restoring some wetlands because it's also very close to the Santa Ana River.
Okay. So
it's this restoring of this, but it's telling the story of the Native Americans who lived on that site, and they're the Acjachemen. It's kind of the primary tribe of Orange County.
Okay.
So the history of the Acjachemen and the history of the site are just completely linked together. So the Acjachemen lived on the site for 12,000 years. It's what or more.
I see.
There was a Acjachemen village, large village on that site.
Okay.
For 12,000 years.
Okay.
And when the Spanish came in 1770s, they relocated them to build the Mission San Juan Capistrano.
I see.
And the Spanish turned it into a cattle ranch, which immediately started to degrade the natural grasses and the natural habitat.
Sure.
Because cows are an invasive species. And so it was a cattle ranch from 1770s until 1943 when, because of the war, the need of oil.
Okay.
And so the history of the site is the history of European colonialism, of the extractive economy. Yeah. Using nature in a way that will be around for 12,000 years. Yeah. And obviously the fact that the Acjachemen were relocated, it's also the story of environmental injustice. Yeah. So our approach to designing the project, and the project is we've designed a kind of vision design, and it's years away from political struggles still to be overcome before before the next steps. But the goal of the development is in the research and the education is to tell the story of the Acjachemen, not just to tell their story, but to learn their lessons.
I see.
And represent those lessons in the buildings as a way to build modern communities that embody those ideas of living for thousands of years in harmony with nature.
Yeah.
See, we also talked about, so another advantage to these homes that are heat and cool themselves, regardless of the energy source. If we also know that with fires and our uncertain future, that our energy grid may not be so reliable.
Yeah.
And people are already losing their power, the power is being turned off because of fires.
Yeah.
So if a house can cool itself without that energy, it's less of a problem.
Yeah.
And I invite people to think that, that's just not to save our houses from a fire, but that's part of the symptom of the new norm.
Yeah.
That's the impact of climate change.
Yeah.
And so by just looking at nature in a way that, and as a Native Americans think of, we're a part of nature, not different from nature.
Yeah. We
can find solutions to these problems that are starting to come at us with greater speed and more frequent.
Yeah.
And nature it's a pretty extraordinary how many, what we can do by working with nature and looking at history. And how civilizations built cities long before our modern energy grid.
Yeah, it's not just art history. And you and I have talked about this before, but even the notion of architectural history, right? We can take lessons from the cooling towers of ancient Persia, or courtyard homes in Pompeii, or Native American cliff dwellings, or even something that we see a lot around California. That idea of like hacienda roofs, right?
Yeah,
it's a way that we build physical structures to adapt to our natural environment.
A lesson I've learned from working like this is that these decisions that you make, the design decisions you make to make a house more efficient and warmer, it connects the structure to the local landscape. Particularly a project that I'm very proud of is near where I live in Pomona, a water education center.
Okay.
And in the process of designing it, so the question of how do you design the entryway to a water education center, and it's inspired me to go up into the local canyon that's visible from the site. And the canyon was part of the regional water cycle, and the geography.
Okay.
And I think just this to pause and ask, so how do you do this? How does that how does this natural water system work? And I realized, the canyon's part of it. So that would inspire me to design the entrance to the building like a canyon, mimics a canyon. So it becomes, and the rest and other design decisions about how this building within this local regional landscape.
Yeah.
And so these decisions about both energy efficiency, but also kind of the cosmology or the philosophical sense about, or maybe spiritual sense about the building and the landscape. Nature, when one pauses and thinks about that, it just so many beautiful solutions come at you.
Yeah.
It doesn't, I don't think it makes it harder. I think it makes it easier.
So, Carl, we've talked about a lot of things during our conversation, but I want to make sure that there's something that we didn't miss that you really want to talk about. Is there something that we haven't gone through that you really want to give some time to?
Maybe just kind of recapping, this Orange County project, the Banning Ranch.
Okay.
It's been an extraordinary opportunity to work with the local tribal leaders and spiritual leaders of the tribe.
Okay.
To learn in a deeper way what it means to be part of nature. And how to embody those lessons to build a more sustainable, resilient future.
Yeah.
And it circles back around to, the very beginning of even a simple drawing. We make drawings that are based on like rules of perspective, or so even the way we start to make a drawing has a cultural bias, or it's something we learn.
Mm-hmm.
And so from some projects or this trying to think about making buildings more efficient, these lessons about how we are part of nature, have been really important to me, and been very much made to feel deeper by working with Native Americans, learning more and more about that, and connecting those ideas to environmental justice. And there's a UN policy that's called free and prior consent.
Okay.
It's something I want to learn, influence my work more and more.
Okay.
But in particularly a woman that we're working with, she said that through the rules of this free and prior consent from the UN, and which means asking Native Americans, how should we really build, and free and prior informed consent, or FPIC.
Okay.
And it's because these people the Acjachemen in Orange County, who their families have lived on the land for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Yeah. That just there's the respect in wanting to work with nature and the land. Yeah, it's stronger because their ancestors have been there for forever. Yeah, and they think about their way of thinking about nature is also changes how they think about their ancestors. So I think it's really true. It's a really important idea that talk to Indigenous people and ask them how to work with the land. Yeah. So that's something we're excited about working with, expanding with them.
Well, Carl, I'm really glad that you're working on the Orange County project, and I hope that it continues to grow and develop in the way that you've described it. So I thank you for your work.
Well, thanks. Thank you.
So we're coming to the end of our time together, unfortunately, because I feel like we could definitely delve more and deeper into all of the topics that we've just talked about. But I'd like to get into some of the closing questions that we ask all of the guests. And the first question is, for you, what's one of the most important lessons that you've learned so far in your life, or in your work for that matter?
The importance of history.
Yeah.
And the most recently, the important lessons from Native Americans, how that we are a part of nature. And as an architect and trying to design sustainable, this question of part of nature, not separate from it, is kind of how is the starting point to find solutions that work, that are durable, resilient, and affordable.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm hoping that a lot of other people take a cue from the spirit of the things that you're saying, even if they don't listen to this podcast, but they're able to grok and inhabit some of the things that we've talked about. Because I do think that we need to change. We can't continue living in the way that we have. We can't continue building. We can't continue making. We're a part of nature as well. How do we integrate instead of trying to be separate?
Yeah, how do we integrate, not dominate? And
that's right. So what's something, Carl, that you're excited about right now? Like something you're reading, or maybe you're watching or listening to?
There's a couple more recent books that one is a book written in the early 80s, The Machines as the Measuring of Man. Okay. And it's a really interesting social history of European colonial explorers with survey instruments measuring land. Oh. And there's another book that I can perhaps email it to you. Sure. that really is a history of Europeans, the machines, like the mechanical clock in the time, medieval ages. And I think perspective is this invention of perspective is part of that. There's this part of the European culture from medieval time into the Renaissance where there's an interest in developing machines and concepts that brought order to the world and created Western science. And there's a tremendous benefit to that. Yeah. But I think it's important to understand the limitations of these systems and how they have influenced the way we think. Yeah. Pre-20th century science, European science, that was about measuring precisely, with precision. And I think one of the bases of 20th century physics is that in sciences, we really can't know nature without disrupting it.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And I think that's part of that lesson of understanding nature more holistically, more, integrating it, and not using it from the outside, not to dominate it.
Yeah. Well, we'll link to those books in the show notes so that way people can find them easier. So just send them to me later, and we'll make sure that it gets in there. Where can people find out more about you, Carl? Do you have a website?
It's carlweltyarchitects.com, but we'll share that information.
Yeah. Well, Carl, thanks so much for taking time and making the space for our conversation. As before, I learned a bunch.
And I appreciate your interest. Thank you so much.
And thank you for listening to How This Works. This episode was edited and mastered by Troy Lococo. Please subscribe and leave us a review in your favorite podcast app. I have a favor to ask. Would you tell just one other person about the show and why they should listen to it? That would be great. You can find How This Works online at howthisworks.show. It's 3 words, no dashes. Again, that's howthisworks.show. We're also active in the places where social media does its thing. I hope that you learned something from my episode with Carl today. I for sure did. And we'll talk again soon.
I'd love to find out where I read this, and this is probably 10 years ago, but it was a beautiful description of Chinese landscape painting, traditional landscape painting.
Okay.
And it said that Chinese landscape painting, which we're all too often taught isn't as sophisticated as Renaissance art and all of that stuff. It's just a different mode of representation.
Oh, okay.
And it comes from a different way of thinking about nature, this is such a great summary. But it said that this art historian said that a Chinese landscape painting requires you to imagine yourself in the landscape.
Yeah,
it's not that European view of looking through the window and objectifying it. It's that you have to project yourself into the landscape, which is so. Although I think most of the important early 20th century European artists that have inspired me, they say things like that. And they say things like that because they were looking to Chinese art to answer some of those same questions.
I see.